Moving to Bartlesville, Oklahoma was one of the best decisions I ever made, despite a few hiccups. I took a risk with a job opportunity there, and it ended up panning out for me better than I could have expected. However, the move-in process was everything but simple. Getting all of my belongings from my old home to the new one was easy enough. But the first couple of nights in that house, I felt as if I was being tormented. It was almost to the point where I decided to move out within my first week of being there. Thankfully, I decided against it though. My first day in the house was spent making calls to the propane company to add my house to their route and calling the cable company to ensure that my Wi-Fi was going to be set up as soon as possible. And by the time I was done with that, it was already after 7 p.m. So I decided to microwave some dinner before going to bed. That was when I noticed something that, at first, I thought was just my imagination, but I now realize most likely it wasn't. As I was standing in front of the kitchen window, waiting for my food to finish, I thought I saw something move in the small patch of grass alongside my house. As I said, I brushed it off as some new house jitters and went on to eat my dinner before getting ready for bed. Before going to sleep, I did a walkthrough of the home and double-checked that the front door and back doors were locked and that all the lights were off. And after a long day of unpacking, I was asleep in no time. But as quickly as I fell asleep, I was woken up by the sound of banging coming from the front of my house. I jumped out of bed at the sound, and my heart began to pound as I realized that someone was at my front door. But before I could even get out of my bed, it stopped. I slowly made my way through my house to the front door and looked through the people, but surprisingly enough, no one was there. And I would have figured that it was just a prank by one of the neighbor kids if that was the only incident, but it wasn't. After checking again to make sure that no one was outside of my house, I decided to head back into my bedroom and turn the light off before laying down. Before I could even close my eyes though, I was startled out of my bed at the sound of something banging, only instead of the front door. This time, that sound was coming from the wall right behind my headboard. I ran to the other side of the room and faced the wall that the banging was coming from before calling out, "Whoever's doing this, you better stop before I call 911. And to my surprise, the noise stopped again. Now there was no way that I was getting any sleep that night, so I decided to go into the living room and unpack some more as I waited for the sun to come up. And thankfully, the rest of the night remained quiet. The following day, I made my way into town and picked up some groceries before the cable guy came. And when he did, I spoke to him about the incident to see if there was a problem with the kids in the area or something. Which is when he let me know that my house used to be a common hangout spot for squatters and homeless people before it sold. That didn't quite make me feel any better, but at least I could attribute the behavior to someone who was upset that they didn't have a place to sleep that night. However, what came next still shakes me up thinking about it. That night, I watched some TV before going to bed. However, I didn't make it off the couch. I was so tired from the night before that I just passed out as I was watching TV. A couple of hours after falling asleep though, I woke up to the sound of something scratching against the door. And as I listened closely, I could hear the sound of jingling, as if it were someone's keys. And just as I realized that someone was trying to get into my house, I saw the doorknob begin to turn. I stood up from the couch as fast as I could and sprinted toward the door, throwing my entire body up against it to keep it shut. That's when I heard someone step backward on the front porch. I locked the door as I continued to lean up against it, and then I yelled out that I was going to call the police right now. And that time, I actually did. By the time the police got there though, there was no one to be found. They also chalked it up to someone that used to stay in my house when it was abandoned. The only thing they didn't know was how the person got a key. Thankfully, I never had to deal with anything like that again. And after that night, it was as if everyone knew that someone lived there now, and no one ever tried to get inside again. When I was 26 years old, I had finally gotten a new teaching job in Long Island, and my wife, our kid, and I had to move from our home in Rhinebeck, New York, and basically start over. Thankfully, our son was young and had time to make new friends, so that wasn't the problem. The problem for me was that my family had a hard time sleeping in the new house after what happened on the first night. You see, at first, I thought that we were getting an upgrade, moving from a small apartment to an actual house. And when I found out we had an attic, I was excited to have space that I could possibly turn into an office for myself. But after what happened, none of us really liked going up there much. You see, the first day there was awesome. Every house was nice, and our son was excited about the new rooms. But as the day went on, the sun began to go down. Now, when he was younger, my son was very afraid of being alone in the dark, and most nights my wife or myself would end up having to check on him at least one or more times. So when it was time for bed, I could tell that he was a bit on edge, though I hoped that he would be very tired from all of the running around he did in the new house. Sadly, that wasn't the case. After putting him in his room, my wife and I decided to try to get some sleep for ourselves, but we couldn't help but notice all of the little noises that the house was making. I remember telling myself that it was just the house settling, or that it was really windy outside. But in hindsight, I should have listened to my gut when it was telling me that the noises were coming from something else. As I tried to fall asleep, I kept hearing one sound which to me was particularly strange. Coming from right above me, every couple of minutes I could hear the subtle sound of something shuffling across the attic floor. Again, I tried to pass it off as something normal, like a raccoon or something that got into the attic. But as the night went on, I began to freak myself out more and more. And when I heard the sound of something creaking out in the hallway, I began really thinking that something was off. That was when I heard it. The sound of my son yelling from the other room as his door slammed closed. I didn't waste any time getting out of bed and running toward the doorway to check on him, with my wife closely behind me. And as soon as I opened our bedroom door, I could see what made him scream. I looked out of our bedroom and saw someone standing in the middle of the hallway right in front of the door that led up to the attic. My eyes widened as I saw them looking toward my kids' room. I screamed at the top of my lungs as I ran out of my room toward the intruder. I used all of my weight to push him up against the wall as I yelled for my son to stay in his room and for my wife to call the police. The man struggled and tried to get me off of him, but I was full of adrenaline from the experience and I had never held on so tightly to something in my life. We both sat leaning against the wall until the police finally arrived. The police came and questioned the man, who we found breaking into our home. And according to what the intruder told the police, he was actually the previous owner of the house. He claimed that he forgot a box of his wife's jewelry in the attic and was hoping to get it back. But after carefully looking for it, neither my wife nor myself ever found any jewelry box in the attic, and we ended up pressing trespassing charges against him. Nothing like that ever happened again. But for the next couple of years, any noise that my house made basically put me into a state of panic. Living in San Antonio has its ups and downs. The plus side is that the price that I pay for rent is less than half of what I paid in California. And the bad side is some of the strange people that live in the neighborhood. Honestly, if I didn't have a roommate, I don't think I would have lasted past my first week here. Now, I'm much more comfortable, but I'll never forget that first week. I had just moved into my apartment, which at the time was a decent-sized 2-bedroom apartment in a small complex. I shared the apartment with a friend of mine named Zeke, who I knew growing up. He had lived there a year prior to me moving in, but after his roommate left, he asked if I wanted a change of scenery, and I thought that it would be perfect. When I got there, it was great to see him and catch up, and it was even better when I saw that my new room was practically the size of my old apartment. The only issue that I had with the room was that the window didn't have a screen in it. Other than that, I loved it. The first 2 nights that I was there were great. We grabbed some food and I met some of Zeke's friends, as well as I interviewed for a job that I ended up getting. But then came the 3rd day. For the first time I had been in Texas, it actually wasn't smoldering hot outside, and I was able to open my window to air out my bedroom. As time went on, I ended up forgetting that I opened the window and ended up heading into bed that night with it still open. My room was a nice temperature, so I was able to get comfortable and fall asleep really fast. I just wish I hadn't been such a deep sleeper. The next thing I remember is waking up facing the wall that my bed was up against when I felt movement on the bed behind me. At first, I thought it might have been Zeke or something, which irritated me. So thinking that I knew who it was, I turned on my bed to face them and tell them to get out of my room. But even though it was dark in the room, I could tell right away that it wasn't Zeke in my bed. My eyes widened and my mind went blank. I totally froze as I noticed a stranger laying in my bed right next to me, just staring right at me. After a second, I finally came to my senses and was able to let out a loud scream, hoping that Zeke would hear me from the room and come to help. The man in my bed didn't like that I yelled though, and he immediately lunged toward me. I tried to fight him off, but he was too quick, and he had my mouth covered by his hand before I could do anything. That didn't stop me from trying to scream out as loud as I could. Even though they were muffled, I knew that someone would hear something eventually. Thankfully, it only took a few seconds for Zeke to come barging through my bedroom door. The man who had been in my bed jumped off of me at the sound of my roommate busting through my door. Zeke tried to grab a hold of him, but he was able to push Zeke to the ground before climbing right out of my bedroom window. I jumped out of my bed and slammed the window shut and locked it before calling the police. According to the officers that came to the apartment, they couldn't find anyone, but I wasn't the first woman to call in the area. I guess there were 3 other break-ins over the 2 weeks prior to my incident. After that night, I never opened that window again, and thankfully, once our lease was up, we both ended up finding an apartment in a much nicer and safer complex.